Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a name in the long, bloody history of the Horus heresy that carries a weight unlike almost any other. It is not Istvan, where brotherhood was slaughtered on burning plains. It is not Prospero, where a world was reduced to cinders in a single night. It is not Calth, where an entire legion was sent underground to survive. The name I want to talk to you about tonight is quieter than those. It echoes differently. It lands in the chest rather than the mind. That name is Molech. Most people who know Warhammer 40,000 know Molech the way you know a room in a house you were told never to enter. You know it exists. You know it matters. You sense, at some deep and instinctive level, that whatever is inside that room explains a great deal about the structure of the house itself, about why the hallways were built the way they were, about why certain doors are heavier than others. But the room stays locked. The master of mankind preferred it that way. He preferred almost everything that way, because what happened on Molech, in the darkness beneath a jungle world several light years from Terra, was the kind of secret that changes everything about how you understand the Emperor, the Primarchs, the heresy, and the galaxy that still bleeds 10,000 years later because of decisions made in that ancient, terrible dark. So tonight, we are going to open that room. We are going to move slowly, and we are going to look at everything. We are going to trace the full arc of Molech, from its origins in a galaxy that predates the Imperium by uncountable ages, through the Dark Age visit that would alter the course of human history, in through the Great Crusade compliance that carries all the hallmarks of something far more deliberate than it appears, through the thunderous betrayal of the heresy, and finally to the question that haunts the entire story like smoke through old wood. Did the Emperor lose at Molech? Or did everything, every sorrow and every sacrifice, and every river of blood, unfold exactly as he intended? The answer to that question is not comfortable. It is not clean. It does not leave you feeling reassured about the master of mankind's relationship with honesty, or with love, or with the lives of those around him. But it is, in every sense of the phrase, the truth that the Horus heresy has been building toward since the very first page. Settle in. This is going to take a while, and it is worth every moment. There is something important you need to hold in your mind from the very beginning, a piece of context that shapes everything else. The story of Molech is not fundamentally a story about a planet. It is not even fundamentally a story about a battle, though the battle that takes place there during the heresy is extraordinary in its scale and its horror. The story of Molech is a story about the Emperor of mankind and what he was willing to do in order to protect the human race. It is a story about a man who could foresee, to a degree that beggars imagination, the shape of the future, and who made choices in the darkness of 10,000 years ago that would determine what a galaxy full of people would suffer in the millennia to come. To understand those choices, you need to understand something about the Emperor himself. Not the golden figure enthroned on Terra, not the god worshipped by a trillion faithful, not the silent presence on the golden throne that soldiers pray to before they die in the dark. You need to understand the being who existed long before any of those things, the one who walked among ordinary humans for thousands of years, who watched empires rise and collapse into dust, who saw humanity repeat the same terrible mistakes across uncountable generations, and who concluded, with the cold precision of a mind that had observed too much and forgotten nothing, that if something was not done, the species he loved above all others would eventually be consumed by the void it could not stop creating within itself. That being went to Molech because he needed something he could not build alone. What he found there changed him, and the galaxy has never fully recovered. A world born in darkness, Molech before the Emperor arrived. To walk through the history of Molech properly, you need to begin at the beginning, before any human foot had touched its soil, before any house had raised its banners on the continent of Molechari, before the city that would eventually be called Lupercalia was anything more than a cave system beneath jungle undergrowth. You need to begin with the planet itself. Molech is, in the most striking and consequential way, remarkably similar to Terra. The orbital distance, the atmospheric composition, the size, the presence of a moon of comparable scale. All of it mirrors humanity's homeworld with an intimacy that feels less like coincidence and more like purpose. It sits only a few light years from Terra, close enough that early human spacefaring civilization targeted it almost immediately for colonization. People arrived during the golden era of human expansion, the age of technology, when humanity was spreading across the stars with an ambition and a confidence that would not survive the catastrophe to come. They set down roots on Molech's 4 major continents, Estara, Neuropia, Arcanius, and Molechari, and they began building. What they encountered almost immediately was the wildlife. Molech's jungles are not gentle. The beasts that prowl beneath the heavy canopy are enormous and ferocious, creatures that evolved in an environment with no apex predator except themselves, and they greeted the human arrivals with every tooth and claw they possessed. The colonists survived, but only barely, and only by developing a technology that would come to define Molech's culture for all the centuries to follow. They built knights, enormous bipedal war machines of iron and cable and willpower, standing 3 or 4 times the height of a human, capable of walking through jungle terrain that would swallow tanks whole and smashing aside the megafauna that threatened every settlement. The knight suits were not merely tools. They became, over generations, the foundation of a social order, the basis of a nobility, the defining technology of a civilization. Those families who bonded with knights became the ruling class. Those who did not became everything else. By the time the Age of Strife descended and cut Molech off from the wider galaxy, the world was already organized around the primacy of the knight houses, with all the feudal loyalty and bloody internal politics that implies. Chief among those houses was House Divine. The name itself carries a certain gravity, as though whoever chose it understood something about the world's relationship to power and to sacred things. House Divine came to dominate the western territories of Molechari, and specifically a region that would later be built over and renamed Lupercalia, after the most famous figure ever associated with that world. Whether the first members of House Divine chose that location because of the legends that surrounded it, or whether the legends accumulated around the location because of what House Divine became, is difficult to say. What is certain is that the cave networks beneath the western hills of Molechari were considered sacred long before anyone understood why. They were the subject of local mythology and whispered reverence, tied to a serpent deity that the people of Molech venerated in the centuries before the imperial truth arrived to suppress it. That serpent cult matters. It matters more than it first appears, and we will return to it again and again, because it is one of the threads that ties the deepest history of Molech to the tragedy of the heresy. The cult existed because of something real beneath those hills, not a metaphor, not a cultural artifact, something genuinely present in the stone and the dark below, a presence that influenced the people living above it across generations, shaping their spirituality, drawing their devotion, giving their shamans and priests visions in the firelight that they interpreted as divine communication. That presence was the warp gate, as the portal that sat beneath the western hills of Molechari, opening into the realm of chaos itself, breathing the energies of the Imperium upward through the rock like heat from a forge. Nobody built that gate. The lore is clear on that point. Who or what originally created the portal on Molech is unknown and may never be known. It predates human settlement. It predates the colonization of the planet entirely. It was there when the first human foot touched Molech's soil, and the colonists built their civilization above it without understanding what lay below. The way people sometimes build houses on old burial grounds without knowing what the earth has already decided to keep. The serpent cult was, in a very real sense, the spiritual residue of the portal's influence on human psychology across many generations. The cave networks beneath the Western Hills were literally closer to the warp than the rest of the planet, and people, being the sensitive and pattern-seeking creatures they are, responded to that proximity by building belief systems around it, by worshipping the dream images that the portal's emanations produced in receptive minds, by consecrating the caves as holy ground, by maintaining a priesthood whose entire purpose was to cultivate a relationship with whatever great power lived below. They were not wrong that there was power there. They were simply catastrophically underprepared for what the real nature of that power turned out to be. By the time the Age of Strife ended and the lights of the Imperium began to reach across the galaxy, Molech had survived Old Night more intact than most worlds. He and the Night Houses had kept the worst of the chaos at bay, their war machines walking the perimeter between human civilization and the horrors that the Age of Strife had unleashed. House Divine had emerged as the paramount authority on the planet, though that dominance carried its own complications, because House Divine's closeness to the Western Hills and the cave networks below meant that generations of divine nobles had grown up saturated in the influence of something they did not fully understand and could not fully resist. The serpent cult had roots that ran deeper in House Divine than anywhere else on Molech, and those roots would eventually bear fruit of a very specific and terrible kind. But that story belongs to the heresy. Before the heresy, there is the Emperor's first visit, and this is where everything truly begins. Asked the first pilgrim. When the Emperor came to Molech in the Dark Ages, here is the central fact around which everything else orbits. The Emperor of Mankind came to Molech during the Dark Age of technology, sometime around the 20th millennium or earlier, at a point in history when the being who would one day call himself the Master of Mankind was still a figure of enormous power, but not yet an emperor of anything. He was old, impossibly old even then, a being who had lived through the ancient history of terror in ways that the scholars of the 41st millennium can only guess at. He had been many things in the long centuries before the Imperium: a wanderer, a warlord, a guide, a killer when necessity required it, a keeper of knowledge when the world burned around him. He had watched the great experiment of the age of technology unfold with the cautious attention of someone who understood, more clearly than anyone alive, that every era of human prosperity carried within itself the seeds of the catastrophe that would follow. He knew about the warp in ways that most humans never would. He had studied it, probed it, learned its geometries and its hungers across lifetimes that would have broken ordinary minds. He understood that the greatest threat to humanity was not political, not military, not even technological, but psychic, the slow suffusion of human consciousness into a warp that was growing hotter and more aggressive with every generation, every war, every act of suffering that fed the great predators dwelling in the Imperium. He knew that unless something was done, something fundamental and irreversible, the human race would eventually follow the same path that had already consumed other species, the slow hollowing out of their spiritual self, the surrender of their collective soul to forces that existed beyond their comprehension. He needed tools. Specifically, he needed beings that could stand between humanity and that fate, beings powerful enough to reshape a galaxy, beings that could carry something of his own soul, his own anti-chaos nature, his own terrifying resistance to corruption, and bring it to bear across millions of worlds simultaneously. He had the genetic science to build such beings. The Dark Age of technology had been extraordinarily productive in that regard. But genetics alone was not enough. To truly imbue a being with the power to defy the warp itself, yet to give a created being the kind of charisma and spiritual weight that could reshape civilization, to make something that was more than merely superhuman, but was also genuinely resistant to the forces of chaos in ways that would be heritable and teachable and maintainable across generations. He needed something he did not possess. He needed knowledge, from the warp itself. He needed to learn from the things that lived there. This is the decision that defines everything. This is the moment that, looked at with the full weight of what follows, reveals the Emperor not as a simple hero or a simple tyrant, but as something far more complicated. A being willing to descend into the territory of his most ancient enemies, to negotiate with the architects of everything he opposed, to take what they offered and use it against them. Oh, gambling that his own will and his own immunity to corruption would be enough to survive the encounter without being consumed by it. He traveled to Molech aboard a spacecraft. The records, such as they are, describe it as a one-way craft. That detail deserves a long pause. A one-way craft. He arrived knowing the ship would not carry him back. Either he planned to leave by other means, or he planned to never leave at all. That he did eventually return to Terra without the ship is one of the small mysteries that cluster around this story like moths around a flame. The Perpetuals, those immortal and unkillable humans who had walked beside him across the ages, are documented as possessing the ability to travel interstellar distances through the warp without conventional spacecraft. Perhaps he expected to do the same. But perhaps the ship's one-way nature was symbolic rather than literal, a signal to himself and his companions that whatever happened on Molech would fundamentally change the direction of the journey, that there was no going back to what had existed before. He brought companions, fellow Perpetuals, beings of near immortal endurance and psychic sensitivity. Among them was a woman named Olivia Soreka, who would become in many ways the most important secondary figure in the entire Molech story. Soreka was extraordinary even by the standards of Perpetuals. She was empathic with a depth that let her read the emotional states of everyone around her, a gift that was simultaneously a burden and a weapon. She had existed long enough to have gathered a vast library of human experience, to have watched civilizations rise from mud and ambition and collapse back into it, and to have emerged from all of that with a fundamental orientation toward life and toward ordinary people that was unusually warm for someone who had seen as much suffering as she had. She was, by every account we have of her, genuinely good, in the simple and underrated sense of that word. She stood on the surface of Molech and watched the Emperor walk toward the cave system beneath the western hills. She watched him descend into that darkness. And then she waited. Nobody knows exactly how long she waited during that first visit. Time moves differently in the vicinity of a warp gate, and whatever relationship the immaterium has with duration in the materium becomes distinctly unreliable when you are standing that close to an opening between the two. But what the records agree on is that he came back out. He emerged from the gate, changed, aged in appearance, visibly different, carrying something about him that had not been there before, a quality of weight, of additional depth, of power that had been either granted or claimed in whatever negotiation had taken place on the other side of that opening into the realm of chaos. The Emperor said little to his companions about what had happened inside. That silence is itself eloquent. This was not a being who was typically reticent about the mechanics of his plans and his purposes. But whatever the portal had shown him, whatever agreements had been struck in the formless and terrible space beyond the gate, he kept almost entirely to himself. What Olivia Soreka would later describe was a man, if you could still call him that, who seemed to have returned with exactly what he had come for, but who also seemed to have understood, in some fundamental new way, the full cost of what he had just done. He left Olivia Soreka behind. He instructed her to remain on Molech as its guardian, to watch over the gate, to prevent anyone from using it who was not meant to use it. And then he returned to Terra, without the ship he had arrived on, bearing the knowledge that would make the Primarchs possible. Beyond the gate, what waited inside the warp? What actually happened inside the warp gate on Molech is one of the most debated questions in all of 40,000 lore. The books are deliberately oblique about it. Graham McNeill, who wrote Vengeful Spirit and carried primary responsibility for developing the Molech storyline in the Horus Heresy series, but has been characteristically cagey in author notes, describing the portal as leading to the strongholds of the Chaos Gods, and suggesting that what took place there involved bargaining, but refusing to spell out the precise terms or what exactly changed hands. What the lore gives us is a demon's testimony. And here is where things become genuinely complicated, because the primary account of what the Emperor did at Molech comes to Horus through a demonic intermediary. It is an account given by entities whose fundamental nature is deception and manipulation, whose every word is calibrated to achieve a specific effect on the listener. When a demon tells Horus that the Emperor went into the warp gate and bargained with the Chaos Gods for the power to create the Primarchs, and then broke his end of the bargain, we are hearing a story told by the most unreliable narrators in the history of the universe, to the person most psychologically susceptible to being damaged by it. That said, the bones of the account are probably accurate, even if the interpretation is not. The Emperor went through the gate. He emerged with something he did not have before, the knowledge required to imbue the Primarchs with warp energies that would make them more than merely genetically superior humans, but beings of genuine spiritual power, capable of the extraordinary charisma and the near-supernatural martial and intellectual gifts that would make them effective commanders and leaders on a galactic scale. The genetic science to build the Primarch templates was something he already possessed, the product of decades of Dark Age technology and his own unmatched expertise. What Molech gave him was the component he was missing, the technique of weaving the warp itself into a living soul without destroying that soul in the process. Think about what that means for a moment. To create a being like Horus, or Sanguinius, or Robute Guilliman, the Emperor needed to do something that the galaxy's most advanced science alone could not achieve. He needed to reach into the Imperium and draw something out of it, to take the formless potential of warp energy and shape it into qualities of mind and spirit that would persist across a human-scale lifetime. He needed to understand the warp's relationship to consciousness, to individual identity, to the psychological dimensions of being that make a leader rather than merely a soldier. He needed, in short, to learn something that only the entities of the Imperium fully understood, because they were its native inhabitants. And so he went and asked them, or negotiated with them, or took from them. The precise mechanics are unclear, and the Emperor's personal morality around the distinction between asking, negotiating, and taking has always been a matter of some considerable debate among those who study him carefully. The Chaos Gods, for their part, describe the interaction as a bargain made and subsequently broken. They say that the Emperor promised them something, took what they offered, and then defaulted on his end of the arrangement. They use this as justification for the heresy itself, framing the entire catastrophe as a debt collection, the ruinous powers simply ensuring that one way or another they would receive what had been promised. It is worth noting, with full awareness of the irony, that the four powers of chaos are not reliable creditors either. They are perfectly capable of claiming a bargain was struck when none was, of defining the terms of an agreement after the fact in ways that serve their purposes, of using the language of obligation and betrayal to achieve emotional effects in their targets that have nothing to do with any actual contractual breach. If you need a powerful warrior to believe that his beloved father is a hypocrite and a liar who cheated the fundamental powers of the universe to achieve his goals, the story of a broken bargain at Molech is an extraordinarily effective tool, regardless of whether the bargain actually existed or what its precise terms were. The most defensible reading, that drawing from what we actually know rather than what demons have claimed, is this. The Emperor entered the warp through the Molech gate and engaged with the entities he found there in some way that gave him access to knowledge he needed. The nature of what he offered in return, if anything, is not confirmed. What is confirmed is that he emerged from the gate with the tools he required, and that whatever relationship existed between him and the Chaos Gods after that point was characterized by mutual hostility, the Chaos Gods branding him the anathema, their most hated enemy, the embodiment of everything their nature opposed. He was immune to their corruption in ways that no other being was. He was the one mind in the galaxy that they genuinely could not touch, could not whisper to, could not turn. Yet that immunity itself is evidence of a kind. You do not develop that level of resistance to something unless you have spent serious time in its presence and been refined by the experience. Whatever was given, whatever was promised, whatever was taken, he came out carrying it. And the galaxy would never be the same. The price of creation. Primarchs born of a dark bargain. Return now to Terra, where the Emperor arrived back with new knowledge and a purpose sharpened to a fine and terrible edge. The project that followed was perhaps the most audacious act of creation in the history of human science. He built 20 beings from his own genetic material, using the Dark Age technologies of his biotechnical division, weaving each one from the foundation of his own DNA and differentiating them into 20 separate templates, each expressing a different aspect of his own extraordinary nature. And into each of those templates, using the knowledge he had extracted from beyond the Molech gate, he wove the energies of the warp itself, burning something of the Imperium into the spiritual and psychological dimensions of each developing Primarch. The result was supposed to be a generation of demigods, beings who were superhuman in every possible sense, physically, intellectually, psychically, beings with the charisma to unite entire civilizations around their leadership, the strategic genius to conduct wars across multiple star systems simultaneously, the sheer force of presence to make ordinary humans feel that following them was not merely reasonable, but inevitable, even holy, or beings who would carry the Emperor's own anti-chaos nature encoded into their very souls, who would resist the corruption that had swallowed the Eldar and that would eventually come for humanity if nothing stood against it. The warp infusion is what gave the Primarchs their extraordinary qualities of personality, their almost supernatural ability to inspire loyalty and devotion, the almost physical weight of their presence that ordinary humans experienced as something close to religious awe. You cannot explain the degree to which Horus Lupercal, or Rabut Gilliman, or Sanguinius commanded the devotion of millions simply through genetic engineering, however sophisticated. There is something beyond the physical in the Primarchs, something that operates in the psychic and spiritual registers of reality rather than merely the material ones. That something came from Molech, from the knowledge the Emperor brought back through the gate. But it came with consequences that, in retrospect, are almost impossible to look at without flinching. Because the warp energies the Emperor wove into his sons made them susceptible. Not to the same degree as ordinary humans, and not in the simple way of being drawn toward obvious corruption, but in the subtle and profound way of being fundamentally connected to the Imperium, of having warp energy as a genuine component of their soul, rather than an external influence. The Primarchs were, from the moment of their creation, beings in whom the distinction between the material and the immaterial was less absolute than in ordinary humans. The Chaos Gods could not easily corrupt them, but they could reach them, as they could find the particular resonance frequency of each Primarch's warp-infused soul and apply pressure to it over time. This is not an accident in the pure sense of that word. The Emperor knew the risk. He understood that what he was building was vulnerable in this specific way, and he built it anyway, because the alternative, Primarchs who lacked the warp connection, would not have the power needed to achieve what he required of them. It was a calculated gamble. Build beings powerful enough to change the galaxy, accept that their power would make them partially accessible to chaos, trust that his own influence and the strength of their characters would keep them safe. In that calculation, as in so many others, as the Emperor was both right and catastrophically wrong in ways that would only become fully apparent after it was too late to do anything about them. The scattering of the Primarchs, that moment when every one of the gestation capsules was ripped through the warp and hurled across the galaxy to distant worlds, is another moment where Molech casts its shadow. The Chaos Gods stole the Primarchs because they could reach them, because the warp energies woven into those developing souls gave the ruinous powers a purchase they could use. The very thing that made the Primarchs capable of their extraordinary feats was also the thing that allowed them to be taken from their father before he could raise them himself. Decades of careful preparation, of genetic engineering and warp working and extraordinary precision, were undone in an instant of chaos-directed violence, and the 20 beings who would have grown up in the Emperor's own presence, shaped directly by his wisdom and his love, were instead cast onto worlds that would form them in ways he had not planned, that would leave them with wounds and blind spots and vulnerabilities that no amount of later relationship could fully heal. If the Emperor made a bargain at Molech and then broke it, then the scattering of the Primarchs was the price, the Chaos Gods claiming from his children what he had refused to give them directly. In that reading, the entire heresy is the long working out of a spiritual debt, the universe insisting on collecting payment with compound interest over 10,000 years. The implications of that reading are genuinely unbearable. Every death in the heresy, every world burned, every legion corrupted, every ordinary soldier who died defending a civilization that had already cracked at its foundation. All of it tracing back to a cave beneath the western hills of Molech, and a decision made in the dark by the most powerful human being in the history of the species. The scar left behind, Olivia Sureka and the long vigil. While the Emperor returned to Terra and began the long work of unification, while the centuries turned and the wars of Terra gave way to the Great Crusade, while the Imperium expanded outward across the stars, Olivia Sureka stayed on Molech. She stayed for a very long time. The mathematics of it, when you sit down and work it out, are almost staggering. She arrived during the dark age of technology, sometime around the 20th millennium. The Great Crusade and the compliance of Molech took place around 869 in the 30th millennium. That is somewhere in the range of 10,000 years during which Olivia Sureka lived as a guardian on a world most of the galaxy had never heard of, protecting a secret whose full implications she probably did not even know completely. As a perpetual, she was functionally immortal, capable of resurrection even from death. So mere physical survival was not her challenge. Her challenge was something more intimate, the accumulation of time itself, the slow weight of watching the same world exist across 10 millennia, of being present for generation after generation of people who were born and grew old and died, while she remained exactly as she had always been. She adapted. Over the long centuries, she built a life on Molech in the way that very old beings sometimes do, not by maintaining a constant identity across all the years, but by becoming whatever each era required, by living fully in each present moment while carrying the past with her like a second skeleton beneath her skin. She cultivated human relationships. She involved herself in the communities around her. At some point before the heresy, she acquired children, adopted daughters she loved, with a genuineness that the novel Vengeful Spirit makes unforgettably clear. Her devotion to those children is one of the most purely human things in the entire Horus Heresy series. This immortal being, who had outlived entire civilizations, choosing in the face of that eternity to invest herself completely in the specific, fragile, irreplaceable lives of 2 individual children. But she was still there when the Emperor returned during the Great Crusade, still tending her post with the dedication of someone who had decided that if the Emperor trusted her with this, she would not fail it. The return itself must have been extraordinary to witness. After 10,000 years of waiting, after generations of human history playing out above the cave networks, where the gate breathed its warp light in the dark, the Emperor came back. He came with war, or at least the potential for war, bringing with him the lion, the warhawk, the Phoenix Lord, and the son he loved above all others. The compliance of Molech in 869 of the 30th millennium is, on the surface, unremarkable by the standards of the Great Crusade. The planet was brought into the Imperium by a combined force of dark angels, lunar wolves, Emperor's children, and white scars, each led by their respective primarchs. Lion L. Johnson, Horus Lupercal, Fulgrim, and Jagatai Khan. The Emperor accompanied them personally, a rarity significant enough to mark the event as unusual even at the time. The people of Molech did not resist, which the records explain, by saying they had long awaited a return to the Terran fold. No great battle was fought. The Night Houses bent the knee. Cyprian Divine of House Divine was named planetary governor. The Serpent cult was formally suppressed, its worship banned in favor of the Imperial truth. All perfectly standard Great Crusade compliance behavior. What the records do not explain, what makes this specific compliance strange when you look at it hard, is what the Emperor spent 111 days doing on Molech. 111 days. The compliance itself was quick, peaceful, requiring minimal military effort. There was no reconstruction crisis significant enough to demand a personal imperial presence for that duration. There was no diplomatic complexity that would have kept the Emperor and 4 primarchs occupied for nearly 4 months. He was there for a reason that the official records simply do not mention. He went into the caves again. He descended to the gate, and he spent time there. And when he emerged, he spent 111 days reinforcing the planet's defenses with a thoroughness that, in retrospect, tells its own story. He left behind a garrison force of staggering proportions, nearly 100 Imperial Army regiments, 3 cohorts of Titan legions, and detachments from 2 Space Marine legions. This is not the protection you arrange for a routine compliant world. This is the protection you arrange for something you intend to keep secret and safe against any conceivable threat, something you want to remain exactly as it is until the end of time. And then he did something extraordinary. He reached into the minds of his 4 Primarch sons, those beings he had created with warp knowledge and warp energies, those beings who should have had perfect eidetic memories precisely because of what they were, and he erased. He took the specific memories of Molech, of the gate, of everything that made this compliance different from any other, and he removed them. Not clumsily, not partially, not in a way that left obvious gaps that would prompt questioning. And he removed them with the surgical precision of someone who had thought very carefully about how memory works and how to excise it without leaving obvious scars. He left Olivia Soreka there again. Her instructions, refined now after 10,000 years, were specific. Guard the gate. Kill anyone who discovers it. Keep the secret until she is relieved of that duty by death or by explicit instruction from the Emperor himself. Then he left. And he never told his sons why they had been there. A seed planted in the mind. The Emperor's long game begins. Here is where the story becomes something other than history and becomes something closer to a philosophical thriller. Because when you look at what the Emperor did at Molech during the Great Crusade compliance, and a question rises from the evidence that is almost impossible to dismiss once you see it. Why did he bring the Primarchs at all? This is not a casual question. The compliance of Molech was peaceful. It required no military genius on the scale of 4 Primarchs and their legions. The planet's night houses posed no threat that a standard expeditionary fleet could not handle. The Emperor did not typically attend compliances personally, and when he did, he rarely brought more than 1 or 2 of his sons. To bring 4, specifically 4, to an unremarkable world with no recorded resistance, and to spend 111 days there, and then to wipe those 4 sons' memories of the entire visit, this does not fit any logical pattern of normal behavior unless there is something else going on. The theory, developed with considerable supporting evidence by law analysts examining the full arc of the Molech story, is as follows. The Emperor brought the Primarchs to Molech deliberately, not because he needed them for the compliance, not because he wanted them to know about the gate. He brought them, specific Primarchs specifically chosen, so that he could plant a memory. So that when he erased the surface details of the visit, the deep structure remained, like the frame of a painting covered by white paint, invisible under normal circumstances, but recoverable by someone who knew it was there and was motivated to look for it. Consider which primarchs he chose. Horus, his favorite son and the War Master. Fulgrim, the Phoenician, a being of exquisite ambition and dangerous perfection-seeking. Lion L. Johnson, the inscrutable lord of the First Legion, whose relationship with secrecy and hidden knowledge is practically definitional. Jagatai Khan, the Warhawk, a being of enormous tactical insight and philosophical independence. These four, not Sanguinius, whose loyalty was as stable as any Primarch's. Not Rogel Dawn, the rigid and incorruptible guardian. Not Leman Russ, the blunt, loyal executioner. These specific four who share a common quality when you look at them as a group.
I just want to pause here for a second because this is the part of the story where I have to be honest with you about something. When I first went deep on Molech, and I genuinely did not expect it to hit the way it did. I went in thinking it was a cool lore event, Emperor does shady things, Horus exploits it, big battle happens, standard heresy stuff. But the more I sat with it, the more uncomfortable it made me. Because if the trap theory holds, and I think the evidence is genuinely strong, then the Emperor did not just allow the heresy, he shaped it. And that should bother you. It bothers me. And that tension is what keeps me coming back to this lore. And honestly, it is what makes Warhammer 40K something worth taking seriously. But anyways, let's go back to the story.
They are all, in different ways, beings who might rebel. Beings who have enough ambition, or enough intelligence, or enough independence of spirit to consider defying the Emperor under sufficiently extreme circumstances. Two of them did, of course. Fulgrim fell to Slanesh. Horus fell to the four powers collectively, while becoming the instrument of the worst catastrophe in human history. The Lion's loyalty remained with the Emperor, though it was never simple or uncomplicated. The Khan stayed loyal, but walked so close to the edge that many in the Imperium believed for years during the heresy that he had turned. The Emperor, who could see farther into the future than almost any other being in the galaxy, who had access to the Emperor's tarot and the accumulated insight of tens of thousands of years of psychic development, did not make the guest list for that compliance at random. If Molech was a trap, and the evidence increasingly points to it being precisely that, then the trap required a very specific kind of bait. The bait was the memory. The imperfectly erased, not quite gone, but recoverable by a motivated searcher memory of a powerful secret on a heavily defended world. A secret that, once found, would suggest to a rebellious Primarch exactly one thing: that the Emperor had found his power somewhere, that the source of that power could be reached by someone else, that godhood was potentially available to any being brave or desperate enough to go through the gate and claim it. The defenses left behind are part of the trap as well. Not so strong that they could repel a full Primarch assault, but strong enough to make the planet seem genuinely important, genuinely protected, genuinely worth attacking. Too little protection, and the secret seems trivial. Too much, and it becomes physically impossible to get through. At the level of defense at Molech was precisely calibrated to be defeatable by a determined War Master throwing his full forces at it, but not defeatable by anything smaller. This means the secret would only be pursued by someone who was already, irrevocably, at war. Someone who had already made the decision to oppose the Emperor. Someone who had already, in other words, done what the Emperor feared most, and who was now capable of doing only one thing, acting in ways the Emperor could predict. Even the Serpent cult, still lingering in the hidden corners of Molech's nobility despite the official suppression of the Great Crusade compliance, fits into this framework. House Divine's long intimacy with the cave networks, their secret continuation of the old faith in the form of a hidden cult, added another layer of vulnerability to Molech's defenses, an internal treachery that a sufficiently skilled manipulator could exploit when the time came. Fulgrim visited Molech before the battle itself. Fulgrim, already well along his path of corruption, had conversations with members of House Divine that the lore describes as influential. The first seeds of the house's eventual betrayal during the battle were probably planted in those quiet conversations, years before the vengeful spirit appeared in the Molech system. All of this sits inside the larger argument that the Emperor, 10,000 years before Horus was born, 10,000 years before the heresy began, was already planning for the contingency of rebellion, not hoping for it, not intending it, but knowing, while with the bleak clarity of someone who has watched human history long enough to understand that even the best designed systems eventually fail, that the Primarchs were not infallible, that the warp energies woven into their souls made them specifically accessible to the things in the Imperium that would most want to turn them, and that if the heresy came, he needed a way to ensure that it ended in a way that served his purposes. Molech was that way. Molech was the place where the rebellious son would come for power, and where, by seeking that power, he would make himself into something that could only do one thing next. Horus remembers. The hunt for the forbidden world. The story of how Horus discovered Molech's secret is itself a piece of storytelling that rewards close attention. Because it is not the story of brilliant deduction or heroic investigation. It is the story of a prepared mind encountering prepared evidence and drawing the prepared conclusion. It is, in short, exactly the story the Emperor wanted to happen. Arriving on schedule after the opening moves of the heresy had already been made, and the War Master's path had already narrowed to the point where his choices were becoming increasingly predictable. By the time the events of Vengeful Spirit begin, the heresy is well underway. The Istvan massacres are history. The galaxy is at war. Horus has been confirmed in his rebellion, has gathered his traitor brothers, has begun the long and grinding drive toward terror. He is, despite all of this, and perhaps precisely because of all of this, a being in transition. The Horus of the opening trilogy, us the brilliant and beloved War Master, who was the finest thing the Great Crusade ever produced, is slowly being replaced by something else. The corruption that began on Davin, the terrible wounds to his soul, the bargains made with powers that are never satisfied by what they are given, are doing their work. Horus is aware of this at some level, and he is aware that he needs more power, more certainty, more of whatever it was that the Emperor had, that quality of near-divine authority that had always seemed to come from somewhere other than simple genetics or political position. The planet of Dwell gave him the key. In the preserved memories of Dwell's dead colonists, some of whom had originated from Molech, Horus encountered fragments of information that activated something in him, a sensation of recognition without context, a feeling of significance without memory. Primarchs are not supposed to have gaps in their recall, beings of perfect eidetic memory, engineered to retain everything they have ever experienced with absolute fidelity. The fact that Horus has a gap, a specific and suspicious gap, centered on a world he knows he visited during the Great Crusade, is not something his extraordinary intelligence ignores. It is precisely the kind of anomaly that a mind like his cannot let rest. He summoned Fulgrim and Mortarion. The three of them had all been at Molech. All three of them had the same conspicuous absence in their perfect memories, the same unmistakable fingerprints of deliberate erasure. A father who erases his own son's memories of a place he clearly went to great lengths to keep secret is a father who is hiding something. And in the context of the heresy, a secret the Emperor was hiding was a weapon aimed at the enemies of the Emperor's vision. Enemies who now included Horus himself. The conversation between the three Primarchs about this discovery has a strange quality in the novels, a mixture of cold strategic reasoning and something more personal, something that sounds, beneath its rationality, remarkably like the anger of children who have been lied to. Because whatever else Horus believes about the Emperor's reasons for the rebellion, whatever elaborate philosophical justifications he has constructed for his choices, the discovery that his father altered his mind without consent, removed memories without permission, treated him as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be trusted, lands with a particular weight. But it makes the Emperor not merely a political opponent, but a being who has already, in a very intimate way, done violence to Horus by taking something from him that he had a right to keep. This is significant because it is also, almost certainly, intended. If the Emperor was indeed planting a trap, then the emotional texture of the bait matters as much as the logical structure. A being as complex and wounded as the post-Darwin Horus is not moved solely by calculation. He is moved by feeling, by the accumulated grievances and resentments and loves that have been slowly redirected by years of chaos influence and his own internal evolution. The discovery of the memory wipe does not just give Horus a reason to go to Molech. It gives him a reason to go to Molech angry, or to go to Molech with the fire of genuine personal betrayal beneath the strategic calculation, to go not merely as a general seeking tactical advantage, but as a son who has been lied to and who is now going to find out the truth at whatever cost. The decision to invade Molech was not, on paper, strategically obvious. Molech was far from the main theatre of war. It was heavily defended. Attacking it would take resources away from the main drive toward terror. There were good military arguments against the detour. Horus made the decision anyway, because some things are not primarily about strategy. He recruited Mortarion and the Death Guard to support the invasion. The Death Guard's Primarch had his own complicated relationship with the memories of Molech, his own gaps that had been filled in only partially by the intelligence gathering at Dwell. The two Primarchs were different beings, but they shared the sensation of having been managed, of having their relationship with their own past controlled without their consent, and that shared wound created a common purpose. The fleet that moved toward Molech was enormous. The invasion that was about to begin would be one of the largest single engagements of the entire heresy. The Battle of Molech, a world drowned in fire. The Battle of Molech is the kind of engagement that, in a less terrible universe, would be studied for its tactical ingenuity and its sheer operational scale. In this universe, it is primarily studied as the context in which Horus Lupercal did something that changed the nature of the war and changed the nature of the War Master himself. But the battle deserves attention on its own terms, because it was genuinely extraordinary, and because the humans who died in it, the soldiers and knights and pilots and ordinary people who had no idea that everything happening around them was the consequence of a secret 10,000 years old, deserve to have their story told. The initial phase was the destruction of Battlefleet Molech. Horus approached the system with a force that included the Sons of Horus, the Death Guard, and no fewer than 4 Titan legions. Along with the demonic presence of the resurrected Death Guard captain, Ignatius Grulgor, and various other forces of chaos that had gathered around the War Master's campaign. The Loyalist orbital defenses were substantial, the platform network that had been left in place since the Great Crusade still functioning after all the intervening decades. Horus neutralized them with a ruthlessness and efficiency that is, even by Horus's standards, remarkable. He captured the orbital defense platforms and turned their weapons against the Loyalist fleet, using the system's own defenses to tear apart the ships that had been positioned there to protect it. The wreckage of Battlefleet Molech fell into the atmosphere like 100 small catastrophes, each burning hulk trailing fire across the sky and striking the surface with impacts that sent waves of destruction radiating outward for hundreds of kilometers. Cities were destroyed not by intentional bombardment, but by the simple weight of falling debris, by the tsunamis that coastal strikes sent racing inland, by the fires that spread through the jungle where the colonial architecture mixed with ancient growth. This was not, even by the standards of the Horus heresy, a gentle war. The ground campaign was a thing of terrible beauty, if you can apply that term to organized slaughter. Horus himself landed at the island of Damesk, the same landfall point where the Emperor had first set foot on Molech all those ages ago. He walked the Fulgurine path, and the ancient route that had acquired near-mythical status in Molech's folk memory as the path of the Lord of Storms, the legendary figure who had come to their world in the earliest days. That Horus was consciously retracing his father's steps, performing a kind of dark pilgrimage across terrain his own memory had been stripped of, adds a layer of psychological complexity to the already dense atmosphere of the campaign. The initial landing at Damesk was not easy. The Loyalist forces, led by Lord General Tiana Kurian and distributed across the planet's 4 major defensive theaters, responded with everything they had. Some 58 million Imperial army troops were committed to the defense of Molech, along with the planet's night houses, its PDF divisions, and every other force that could be brought to bear. Yet the Sons of Horus took heavier casualties during the beachhead action at Damesk than in almost any engagement since Istvan. The Loyalists were fighting to protect their world, and even in the face of Horus Lupercal in person, that counted for something. Raven Divine made a decision during the early ground campaign that deserves specific attention, because it is one of the pivotal moments of the battle. Raven, the second son of Lord Cyprian Divine, was a complicated figure even before the heresy arrived on his doorstep. His relationship with his mother Sabella and his twin sister wife Lix had long since crossed every boundary of ordinary Molechan nobility, and his family was already deeply enmeshed in the hidden serpent cult that had persisted beneath Molech's imperial surface since the Great Crusade compliance. Lix was gifted with something like prophecy, and she had told Raven of a vision in which a warrior in the night Banalash would turn the tide of the battle for Molech. Raven believed this referred to himself. He took 10 knights and led them against Horus Lupercal in person. What followed was extraordinary in the way that encounters between mortals and demigods are always extraordinary, briefly, intensely, and with enormous asymmetry. Raven's shot found Horus, a lance of night-scale energy that should have been fatal to anything not carrying the protection of gods. The Luperci, Horus's most devoted sons of Horus warriors, swarmed around their Primarch and absorbed the energy into the warp through some miracle of collective devotion and chaos favor. Horus, wounded but not destroyed, had turned on the knights with Worldbreaker in hand and demonstrated, in the most personal terms possible, exactly what he had become. He killed several of Raven's sons. He drove the surviving knights from the field. Raven's prophecy had not quite meant what he thought it meant. The Death Guard came ashore at Ophir and began their advance toward the capital of Lupercalia, with Mortarion at their head. The demon Prince Grulgor, resurrected and transformed, was unleashed on the jungle interior with a concentration of the Life Eater virus fused into his own changed body, and the result was a swath of destroyed forests stretching for thousands of kilometers. The beasts that had defined Molech's ecology for all of human history suddenly fleeing their ancient territory in panicked masses that crashed into the Loyalist defensive lines and broke them as effectively as any military assault. The Perceptor line, the primary Loyalist defensive network, fell. House Indra and House Kaushik, 2 of Molech's night houses who had remained loyal to the Emperor, mounted desperate resistance at Leosta, but they were overwhelmed by the Legio Crucius, the Legio Vulpa, and the Legio Vulcanum, 3 Titan legions that represented firepower on a scale that Knight suits simply could not match. Blood Angels were there too, a garrison force that had been positioned on Molech, and they fought with the desperate valor of their legion and their Primarch's legacy until the Red Angel was deployed against them. At that demonic presence, summoning something in the Blood Angels' own warp-touch souls that their faith had always held in check. They chose death over corruption, a mass suicide that is one of the most tragic moments in a battle full of tragic moments. And then House Divine broke everything. Albard Divine, the firstborn son of Lord Cyprian, had been imprisoned by his half-siblings for years, kept drugged and confined while the cult that had taken over the house's inner circle used his absence to prepare their betrayal. When he finally broke free, when his mother's blood was on his hands, and he emerged from his long captivity, wearing her exosuit to support his wasted body, he was not the sane man he had once been. He was a figure operating in the borderlands of reason, driven by the conviction that he was the Emperor himself, reliving the first conquest of Molech, saturated in the Sla-Nashi energies that had been building in Banalash and in the house's culture for years of hidden cult practice. He led the house's knights not against the traitors, but against the paragon of terror, the most powerful Loyalist asset on the field. an Imperator-class Titan, whose fall had been the one thing preventing a complete rout of the Imperial defensive lines. Albard's combined Night Lance strike, delivered from inside the Titan's void shields, brought Paragon of Terror down in an explosion that leveled a large portion of the battlefield and tore the heart out of the Imperial defense. After that, there was no coherent defense left. The Loyalists were surrounded, outgunned, and betrayed from within. Of the entire Imperial host, 1 in 100 survived the campaign, evacuated aboard the refugee ship Molech's Enlightenment. Horus deliberately let it go. He wanted the survivors to reach other Imperial worlds and tell what they had witnessed. He wanted the terror of Molech to precede his army toward terror. 99 of every 100 defenders of Molech died. 58 million soldiers, and the civilians they had been protecting, and the Knight families, who had given their lives for an emperor who had been planning their sacrifice for 10,000 years. Horus moved toward the caves beneath the western hills, toward the gate, through the gate. Horus ascending into something new. Olivia Soreka had been preparing for this moment for all of her long vigil. She had recruited the handful of surviving Ultramarines who remained on the planet after the battle. Those dwindling warriors who had debated whether to evacuate to Ultramar and serve the 500 worlds, and had been prevented from that option when their own tech marines destroyed their vehicles to force them to honor their oath of defense. She had gathered what allies she could find in the burning ruins of a world that was almost entirely consumed by the forces of chaos. And she had gone to the gate. The journey through Lupercalia to the cave networks was fought at every step, with the sons of Horus and the Death Guard pressing in from every direction and the small group of Ultramarines dying one by one to buy the Perpetual the time she needed to reach the gate and seal it. There is something almost unbearable about that sequence of events. Those perfectly ordinary Space Marines of the Ultramarines Legion dying in an alien cave network on a world that is not their own, for a secret they had only been told about hours before, to protect a prize that, if they had known its full implications, would have forced them to question everything they believed about the Emperor they were dying for. Olivia reached the gate. She began the ritual to seal it, using her own psychic power in the kind of act that the Perpetuals are uniquely capable of, feeding something of her own immortal essence into the closure process, drawing the gate shut with the force of will and the long accumulated weight of 10,000 years of devotion to a purpose she had accepted without fully understanding it. She almost succeeded. Horus arrived with the Justiren, his first company, and he killed her. His talon pierced her through, and the ritual was broken, and the gate remained open. But it had been damaged by what she had managed to accomplish, structurally compromised in ways that would be relevant to what Horus found on the other side. Horus shattered the gate with Worldbreaker and stepped through. What happened next, on the other side of that threshold, is one of the things that the Horus Heresy series handles with the most deliberate obscurity. Graham McNeil has said in author notes that what Horus experienced beyond the gate would require a trilogy of its own to properly tell, and that without that proper telling, he was not willing to reduce it to a few paragraphs in an existing book. What the novel gives us instead is external. Moments pass in which the sons of Horus who remain on the Molech side are blinded by darkness. Then Horus reappears. He is visibly different. He has aged, in the way that someone ages when they have spent years, not moments, living through experiences that mark the body as well as the soul. And when he speaks, he says he has gotten exactly what he wanted. The implication of the darkness and the apparent time distortion is that Horus did not simply step through and return. He spent time in the warp that did not correspond to the time that passed on the Molech side. He journeyed. He encountered the four ruinous powers, or their representatives, or the deep warp presences that constitute their most fundamental nature. He was assessed, bargained with, tested. He campaigned at the head of demon armies in the realm beyond reality, earning through conflict and demonstration what the Emperor had obtained through whatever combination of negotiation and force he had used on his own visit. And he emerged the other side of all of that, carrying what he had come for, a measure of power equal to what he believed his father had obtained, the power of a god contained in a mortal form. This is Horus at what looks, from the outside, like his absolute apex, the War Master ascendant, the rebellious son who has taken the forbidden fruit from the highest shelf and consumed it whole, without apology, without hesitation. He stands in the ruins of a world his forces have just destroyed and declares that he has become what his father always was. As that the secret his father tried to keep from him is a secret no longer. That the heresy has just acquired the momentum of something that cannot be stopped. He points the vengeful spirit toward Terra. The heresy enters its final phase. He does not know, stepping back through the ruined gate, that he has just done exactly what the Emperor needed him to do. The Emperor's long game. How Molech doomed the man who thought he had won. Here is the part of the story that requires you to hold two things simultaneously, which is not a natural cognitive skill for most of us, but is one that the Emperor of mankind apparently practices effortlessly across multiple millennia. The first thing is that Horus genuinely did become extraordinarily more powerful after Molech. This is not in dispute. Daz, the War Master who emerged from the Warp Gate, was a transformed being, possessing power that other Primarchs, other Primarch-level entities, could feel from across the system. He was, by the standards of any reasonable assessment, closer to a god than to a man. The Chaos Gods had poured something of themselves into him, the kind of favor they usually reserve for their greatest champions. And he had survived the process and remained recognizably himself, which is itself a testament to how extraordinary Horus was even before any of this. The second thing is that this power was killing him. Not quickly, not obviously, but the mortal body of Horus Lupercal, however extraordinary that body was, however superhuman its regenerative capacity and its tolerance for extremes, was not built to contain the energies of 4 Chaos Gods simultaneously. But the accounts of the Siege of Terra are full of small but significant details. Horus, isolated on the vengeful spirit, rarely appearing in person, conducting the battle through proxies and representatives, rather than from the front lines in the way that had always been his natural mode of leadership. Horus increasingly distracted, his attention divided between the material war and some vast ongoing struggle in the warp that was consuming enormous quantities of whatever remained of his original energy. Horus appearing, to those closest to him, to be burning from within. The godlike power he had claimed at Molech, burning through the vessel that contained it, the way light burns through a lens held too close to a flame. The power Horus obtained at Molech was a countdown, a death sentence disguised as a coronation. Yes, and this is where the jaws of the Emperor's trap close with the precision of something designed and maintained over 10,000 years of patient preparation. Because once Horus went through that gate, once he accepted the full measure of chaos divine favor into his mortal form, his options contracted sharply. He could not consolidate his gains in the traditional military sense, taking time to rest, to rebuild depleted legions, to secure his supply lines, and attend to the long-term administrative health of his campaign. The burning inside would not allow time for that. He could not create an alternative Imperium in opposition to Terra, a stable political entity that could sustain a war of attrition against the loyalists. The fire in him would consume whatever he built before it matured. But he could not wait for the reinforcements that were coming from the far corners of the galaxy to arrive and change the strategic picture. He did not have time to wait for anything. The only thing he could do, the only rational response to the biological and spiritual reality of what had happened to him at Molech, was to drive as fast and as hard as possible toward Terra and force a confrontation with his father before the power inside him completed its work. He needed to reach the Emperor. He needed to kill the Emperor. He needed to do it soon. Anything else was a slower version of the same ending. This means that after Molech, Horus was not a free agent in any meaningful sense. He was a missile that had been aimed. Every decision he made from that point forward was constrained by the fundamental reality of his physical condition. channeled by the burning urgency of a man who was running out of time in the most complete way possible. The Emperor had removed his freedom of action by giving him exactly what he wanted. There is another dimension to this worth dwelling on. The power Horus obtained at Molech was the power of the 4 Chaos gods. All 4 of them, united in their investment in Horus as their champion. This means that killing Horus at the Siege of Terra was not merely killing a Primarch or killing the War Master, it was doing something that unmade a significant portion of the Chaos God's investment in the material universe. The death of Horus, achieved through his own overreach and his own blind pursuit of his father's secret, would send the forces of chaos into disarray in ways that no purely military victory could ever have accomplished. While it would not destroy the Chaos Gods, obviously. Nothing can destroy the Chaos Gods while suffering and desire and fear continue to exist in conscious beings. But it would break the momentum of the heresy, scatter the traitor legions, end the unified campaign against Terra with decisive finality. The Emperor needed Horus to be exactly what Horus became at Molech, too powerful for any conventional force to stop, too burning bright to survive long enough to exploit that power, and mortally aimed directly at Terra where the Emperor could reach him. The Emperor needed to be the only being in the galaxy capable of ending Horus, and he needed Horus to come to him, because the Emperor could not leave. The Webway project had failed. The breach in the Webway needed to be maintained by the Emperor's presence on the Golden Throne. He was trapped on Terra, which meant that Horus needed to come to Terra, which meant that the burning inside Horus needed to be something that gave him no alternative. Molech accomplished all of this. Molech was, from beginning to end, a weapon aimed at the largest possible target, the heresy itself, the rebellion of the most beloved son, the threat that could not be stopped by any army or any conventional power the Imperium could muster. The Emperor built the weapon during the Dark Age of technology, maintained it across 10,000 years of patient and extraordinarily costly preparation, and deployed it at precisely the right moment. The cost was the lives of everyone on Molech, the 58 million soldiers who died in the battle, the civilians who died in the tsunamis and the orbital debris impacts and the long years of occupation that followed. Olivia Sarica, who had given 10,000 years of her immortal life to guarding a secret whose full implications she was probably never told. Every human being in the galaxy whose suffering contributed to the chaos power that was poured into Horus at Molech, that burning power that killed him as surely as the Emperor's own hands. The Emperor played a very long game on Molech. He won. And the price of that victory was, in the accounting that history keeps, impossible to justify by any ordinary moral arithmetic. This is the Emperor of mankind, at his most comprehensible and his most alien, a being who cares, genuinely and profoundly about the human species as a whole, and who demonstrates that care by treating the lives of individual humans as acceptable losses in a calculation that stretches across tens of thousands of years. Whether you regard that as the action of a guardian or a tyrant is one of the questions that Warhammer 40,000 has always been most interested in, and Molech is where it is asked most directly. The morning after, Horus on the threshold of Terra. The transformation that Molech wrought in Horus was not merely spiritual. The novel Vengeful Spirit and the subsequent Siege of Terra books give us a portrait of a being who is visibly different from the War Master of the early heresy, and not different in the way of simple corruption, the kind of obvious demonic warping that characterizes the most fallen of his brothers. Horus remained, superficially, recognizable as himself. But he maintained his physical appearance with the newfound power he carried, presenting the face of the War Master, the beloved first son, the brilliant commander. But those who knew him well, the Mournival, his equerry and closest lieutenants, could feel something behind that surface that had not been there before. A vast and terrible depth, a sense of something enormous operating behind the familiar features, the way you might sense the weight of deep water beneath a thin layer of ice. He emerged from the warp already carrying the marks of the years he had spent there. The aging was real, an unusual sign in a being capable of healing almost any wound. He had spent what felt like years beyond the gate, campaigning at the head of armies that existed in a dimension where time flows according to its own arbitrary rules. Yet he had been tested and found worthy by the powers of the warp in the most direct way possible, had earned what they gave him through demonstration rather than petition. And what they gave him was, undeniably, enormous. The Iron Hands warband that intercepted him in the void before Molech had discovered, to their enormous cost, that Horus Lupercal was something they could not fight. His presence alone was enough to send shock through the material universe in ways that went beyond the ordinary metrics of combat. He had always been extraordinary. After Molech, he was something that the word extraordinary does not quite contain. And yet, the cost, the burning, the isolation on the vengeful spirit as the siege of Terra ground on, and his commanders fought and died on the surface below without his direct presence. And the Horus who appears in the Siege of Terra books is a figure of tremendous power and growing disconnection, a being who has traded something fundamental about his relationship with the material world for the godlike energies he carries. He is less in some ways than he was before, even as he is more. The War Master, who had led by inspiring love and genuine admiration from his legion, has been replaced by something that commands through the sheer weight of warp-backed authority. His relationship with his sons has shifted from something paternal and warm to something more distant, more instrumental. He is still Horus, but he is also already becoming what he will be at the end. The vessel, the weapon, the thing that the Chaos Gods have been building towards since they first recognized what the Emperor was trying to do at Molech. Yet he did not know this. That is the other tragic dimension of the story. Horus believed, genuinely and completely, that at Molech he had freed himself from the constraints that had always defined his position relative to his father. He had gone to the source of the Emperor's power, claimed the same power for himself, and emerged as an equal rather than a subordinate. From his perspective, the heresy was no longer a rebellion against an unchallengeable superior, but a genuine conflict between two beings of comparable divine standing, a war between fathers and sons for the right to determine humanity's destiny. The Chaos Gods had told him this was the truth of things, and the power he felt burning inside him seemed to confirm it. He was wrong in the most specific and carefully prepared way possible. The Emperor was not made by Molech the way Horus believed. The Emperor had existed as an extraordinary psychic entity for tens of thousands of years before the Molech visit, and whatever the visit gave him was not the foundation of his power, but an addition to it. The nature of Horus's experience in the warp, years of campaigning and proving himself to the Chaos Gods in exchange for their direct investment, was fundamentally different from whatever the Emperor had done, and the power it produced was fundamentally different as well. More concentrated, more immediately overwhelming, and far less sustainable. The Emperor had the warp power of 10,000 years of psychic development, reinforced by the accumulated belief of trillions of humans who had come to regard him as divine. And Horus had the warp power of 4 gods who had found a useful champion and were willing to burn that champion to cinders if it gave them what they wanted. These are not equivalent sources of power, however similar they might look from the outside. What it all means. The legacy of Molech in the galaxy that followed. The Battle of Molech ended in 224 of the 31st Millennium. The Siege of Terra ended shortly after. The Emperor won at a cost that, by almost any accounting, made the word victory feel inadequate. He killed Horus, erased his soul from existence to prevent the Chaos Gods from resurrecting him as a demon prince, and in doing so sent the traitor legions fleeing into the Eye of Terror, where the Great Scouring would hunt them for centuries. Then he lay down on the golden throne and began the 10,000-year vigil that continues to the present moment of the 41st Millennium, his body decaying around a mind that still burns with something undimmed, sustaining the Astronomicon, holding back the void, waiting. Molech itself was left to the Death Guard and the Emperor's children in the aftermath of Horus's victory there. What became of the planet after the siege, whether it was eventually reclaimed for the Imperium, or whether it remained in the possession of traitor forces, or was reduced to a dead world by the long aftermath of the battle, the lore does not comprehensively resolve. What the planet had contained, the gate itself, was functionally destroyed. Olivia Soreka's ritual had damaged it. Horus had shattered it with Worldbreaker. Whatever opening had existed there, whatever access to the deeper warp it had provided for whoever knew how to use it, was gone. The room was finally locked from the inside, the key melted, the door itself reduced to rubble. Olivia Soreka survived, because perpetuals survive. She appeared on the ship Molech's Enlightenment, finding her way back to the daughters she had chosen, carrying the weight of 10,000 years of service and the specific grief of someone who has watched the thing she was guarding be destroyed by the person she least wanted to see succeed. Her subsequent journey toward Terra, the time she spent on Molech's Enlightenment, navigating the treacherous politics of getting a refugee ship safely through the solar system's increasingly paranoid defenses, and the further complications involving a surviving fragment of the serpent cult that had hidden itself among the passengers. All of this is its own story, and it is a story that tells us something important about what she carried out of Molech. Not certainty, not closure, but the determination to keep moving forward, to keep protecting the people immediately in front of her, to keep choosing life, even when everything around her suggested that life was exactly what the universe was least interested in preserving. She eventually reached Terra and survived the siege, participating in one final act of extraordinary consequence that would tie her story to the Emperor's fate in a way none of it could have predicted. But that is a story for another night. What Molech leaves behind beyond the immediate historical events, and is a set of questions about the Emperor that the Imperium has never been able to answer honestly, partly because the Imperium is not structured for honest self-examination, and partly because the answers are genuinely uncomfortable in ways that do not resolve cleanly in either direction. Did the Emperor make a deal with chaos? Probably, in some form, yes. What that deal was, what he offered, whether he intended from the beginning to break it, whether there was any deal at all, or whether what the demons described as a bargain was simply his presence in the warp and his return from it with knowledge he acquired through means other than negotiation. All of this remains genuinely unclear, and deliberately so. The Emperor does not explain himself. He never has. The galaxy that serves him, that sacrifices 1,000 psychers a day to feed his existence on the Golden Throne, serves a being whose full nature and whose actual motivations are, even after 10,000 years, not fully known to anyone who might tell the story. Did the Emperor plan Molech as a trap for Horus? The evidence is compelling. The choice of Primarchs to bring to the compliance. The imperfect nature of the memory wipe, sufficient to obscure, but not to prevent recovery by a motivated seeker. The calibrated level of defenses, strong enough to seem important, weak enough to fall. The allowed persistence of the serpent cult, providing an internal lever for a future traitor to use. The absolute certainty with which the Emperor, chained to the Golden Throne on Terra and unable to fight in the field, sat and waited for his son to come to him. These are not the behaviors of a being who was surprised by what happened. These are the behaviors of a being who has been waiting, for a very long time, for exactly this. If that is true, then the moral weight of what the Emperor did at Molech extends far beyond a single world. Every human being who died in the Battle of Molech died in service of a plan they knew nothing about. Olivia Soreka gave 10,000 years of her immortal life to a guardianship that the Emperor had designed, at some level, to be penetrated eventually. The 58 million soldiers who died in those jungles and on those beaches and in those flooded cities died because the Emperor needed Horus to come there, needed Horus to go through the gate, needed Horus to become the burning god that would come to Terra and be destroyed. This is the Emperor at his most vast and most terrible, a being who moves pieces on a board that spans millennia, whose love for humanity in the aggregate is matched by his apparent willingness to sacrifice individual humans in specific ways for the sake of calculations that never reach completion, that always require just one more sacrifice, just one more acceptable loss, just one more consequence that someone else will bear, while the master of mankind absorbs the knowledge it produces and adjusts his plan accordingly. Is this a guardian? Is this a tyrant? Is this a god? Is this the greatest father who ever lived, or the worst? The lore of Warhammer 40,000 does not answer these questions. It asks them again and again in different registers and from different angles, and it asks them because they are genuinely open. The universe of the 41st millennium is what it is partly because of the choices made on Molech. And the universe of the 41st millennium is exactly as terrible and exactly as enduring and exactly as worth fighting for as it appears to be. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and holding them both without resolving either is what the most sophisticated engagement with 40K ultimately asks of you. There is one more thing worth saying about Molech, something that the long sweep of this story makes easy to lose sight of amid the strategic analysis and the philosophical questioning. Amid all the 10,000-year plans and the godlike powers and the civilizational stakes, there is a woman named Olivia Sarika who stood in a cave on a jungle world and tried to close a door so that the person she loved least in that moment could not walk through it. She was not trying to save the Imperium. She was not thinking about the Emperor's long game. She was thinking about the gate and the ritual and the daughters on the ship who needed her to come back. She almost succeeded. Horus killed her before the closure could complete, but the damage she had done to the gate shaped what Horus found on the other side, made his experience there different, and in some ways more limited than it would have been through an intact gate. Her sacrifice mattered in the specific and immediate way that all real sacrifice matters, regardless of whether the grand design ever acknowledges it. The history of Molech is, in the end, the history of individuals inside enormous forces. A woman choosing to guard a door for 10,000 years out of loyalty to a cause she understood only partially. A Primarch walking a path laid out for him by someone who loved him in ways that cannot be separated from having arranged his destruction. An Emperor who holds 10,000 years of chess moves in a mind that processes eternity in the way ordinary humans process a morning. Who chose to pay any price for the survival of the species he had dedicated his existence to protecting, and who will sit on a golden throne for the rest of time, sustaining the light that guides his children's ships through the dark, while somewhere in the galaxy, the consequences of Molech continue to unfold. That is the story. All of it leads from those caves. All of it. And if you trace the lines carefully enough, traces back to the moment a being of extraordinary power descended into the dark, made a decision that still echoes, and came back out carrying something that changed everything. If this journey into the deepest secret of the Horus heresy lit something up for you, if the story of Molech makes you want to return to the books and read them with new eyes, Vengeful Spirit by Graham McNeil is the place to start, followed by the Siege of Terror series for the long consequence of what that world began. The lore of 40K rewards exactly this kind of slow, careful reading, the kind that notices the details and follows the implications to their end. If you found this video worth your time, the most meaningful thing you can do is leave a like on this video and subscribe to Q on 40K if you haven't already. On every single view and subscription helps this channel keep producing the kind of deep, relaxed, comprehensive lore that the grim darkness of the far future deserves. There is so much more to explore, so many rooms in this universe still locked, waiting for someone willing to take the time to open them carefully and look at what's inside. Until next time, keep reading, keep thinking, and remember that in the 41st millennium, even the victories are stories worth mourning. The unanswered questions, threads the lore has never fully resolved. There is a quality to the Molech story that separates it from most of the other great mysteries of the Horus heresy, and that quality is its deliberate incompleteness. Other mysteries in 40K lore are incomplete because the setting is vast and not every corner of it has been written. Molech's incompleteness is architectural. It was built that way. The gaps in the story are not failures of coverage, but structural features, intentional spaces where the reader is meant to sit with uncertainty rather than resolution, where the discomfort of not knowing is itself part of what the story is communicating. With that said, there are several threads in the Molech story that deserve more attention than they usually receive, threads that the lore raises and does not fully pull, and that are worth examining carefully because they change the texture of everything else we have discussed tonight. The first of these is the question of the one-way ship. The Emperor arrived on Molech during the Dark Age visit aboard a spacecraft that is explicitly described as one-way. He left without it. Now, and this detail has a practical explanation if you accept that perpetuals can travel through the warp under their own psychic power. And we know they can, because Olivia Soreka herself does exactly this during the events on Molech, appearing aboard a ship at the outer edge of the system after walking away from the warp gate without any conventional transport. But the detail still carries weight beyond the practical explanation because someone chose to emphasize it in the telling of the story. Someone decided that readers needed to know the ship was one way. That choice does not happen by accident in carefully crafted lore. The most interesting interpretation is that the one-way ship signals something about the Emperor's internal relationship to what he was about to do. If you arrive on a ship that cannot take you back, yet you have made a statement to yourself as much as to anyone else. Whatever happens in there, whatever comes back out of that gate, is not going to pretend that nothing changed. You are not going to use the ship as a psychological escape hatch, a means of telling yourself that you could always choose not to go through, that you could always return to the status quo. The one-way ship is a commitment device, a way of making the decision irreversible before the moment of maximum psychological pressure arrives. It is the kind of thing you do when you know that if you give yourself the option of retreat, you might take it, and you have calculated in advance that retreating would be the wrong choice. This tells us something about what the Emperor was facing inside that gate, not just powerful entities. Well, not just difficult negotiations or dangerous energies. Something that would test his will specifically, that would create the maximum possible pressure to turn back, to choose the safer path, to accept the world as it was, rather than pay the price of changing it. He removed the option of retreat before he walked in. The second thread worth examining carefully is the question of what the Emperor's relationship with the Chaos Gods was before Molech. The standard framing of the story is that Molech is when the Chaos Gods first became aware of the Emperor, when he first entered their territory and made himself known to them as a significant force. But this framing is probably too simple. The Emperor had been operating as the most powerful human psychic in history for tens of thousands of years before Molech. As he had been shaping human civilization, suppressing chaos influence in the regions where he operated, cultivating the psychic heritage of the human species in ways that were directly opposed to what the ruinous powers wanted for that same heritage. It would be extraordinary if the Chaos Gods had simply not noticed him until Molech. The more likely picture is that they were already aware of him, already categorizing him as a significant obstacle to their plans, already doing what they could to work around or neutralize his influence. What Molech changed is not their awareness of him, but his relationship to their power. By entering the deep warp, by engaging with the entities at the level of their most fundamental nature, he forced a direct confrontation rather than the indirect opposition that had characterized their relationship before. And he made himself known to them in a way that required a response rather than a workaround. And in the terms the Chaos Gods use for such things, which are terms of opposition and claim and cosmic right, his refusal to be corrupted or controlled by the encounter was itself a kind of declaration. He left the warp having demonstrated that he was genuinely immune to their influence. The branding of him as the anathema was their acknowledgement of that demonstration. The third thread is the most speculative, but also, perhaps, the most important for understanding what the Molech story is ultimately about. This is the question of what the Emperor experienced subjectively during his time inside the gate. We know that Horus spent years in the warp during his own passage through the gate. The lore is explicit about the time distortion and about the subjective length of Horus's experience. We do not have the same explicit confirmation for the Emperor's visit, but the principle should apply. The warp's relationship with time is not fixed, and the deeper you go into the Imperium, the less the word time applies in the ordinary sense. If Horus experienced years in a journey that took moments in Molech's material time, then the Emperor's original visit, which involved penetrating to the level of the Chaos God's own strongholds, which the account implies was even deeper and more fundamental than what Horus reached, probably involved a subjective experience of duration that was, by material standards, enormous. What does a being of the Emperor's nature experience when they spend what might be centuries in the deepest levels of the warp? What do they encounter? What do they have to confront about themselves? About the nature of power and its costs? About the relationship between their own purposes and the purposes of the things around them? What do they bring back from that, not just in terms of knowledge, but in terms of psychological texture? In terms of how they relate to time and loss and the weight of understanding things that others cannot understand. The Emperor who emerged from the Molech gate the first time was changed, aged in appearance, carrying something new. The accounts do not tell us in detail what that something was, beyond the practical knowledge about Primarch creation. But the weight he carried afterward, the increasingly impenetrable silence, the increasing willingness to work through millennia-spanning plans rather than direct communication, the increasingly transactional relationship with the people around him, even at the cost of connection. All of this may have roots in whatever he experienced beyond the gate. Not just what he learned, but what the learning cost him at the level of his own humanity. The fourth thread is the question of whether the Primarch project was actually the Emperor's first purpose in going to Molech, or whether there was something else he wanted, and the Primarch knowledge was something he picked up along the way. The lore presents the Primarchs as the reason he needed the Molech knowledge, but the Emperor was doing many things simultaneously during the age of technology, and the Primarchs were not yet conceived as a specific project when he made that first visit, or at least, there is no evidence they were. The visit to Molech seems to have preceded the specific decision to create the Primarchs, which means the knowledge he extracted may have been applicable to the Primarchs without having been sought for them specifically. He may have gone to Molech for a different purpose entirely and recognized, in what he extracted from the experience, the key that would unlock the Primarch project. Or the Primarch project may have been the explicit goal from the beginning. The lore does not resolve this cleanly, and the resolution matters because it changes the character of the preparation. If he went specifically to create the Primarchs, the Molech story is about a calculated and specific acquisition of a specific tool. If he went for some other purpose and discovered the Primarch knowledge as a consequence, the story becomes something more exploratory and more uncertain. A being reaching into the dark because he had to, finding something he could use, and building a plan around what he found, rather than finding what the plan required. Both readings are consistent with the available evidence. Both readings are consistent with the Emperor's character as we understand it, which is itself worth noting as a feature of the Molech story. The Emperor is a being of such depth and such consistent strategic intelligence that almost any specific choice in his past can be read as either perfectly deliberate or as the product of a genuinely exploratory mind, making the best of what circumstances offered. He is not transparent. He was never transparent. And Molech is the place where that opacity is most consequential and most costly. The galaxy that Molech made. Downstream. Consequences in the 41st millennium. The Battle of Molech ended nearly 10,000 years before the events of the 41st millennium. The heresy ended roughly 10,000 years before the present day of the setting. Yet the consequences of what happened on Molech are still playing out across the galaxy that the 41st Millennium portrays. And those consequences are worth tracing, not just historically, but in terms of what they mean for the present state of the universe. The most direct and obvious consequence is the Emperor on the Golden Throne. The chain of causation is clear. The Emperor could not leave Terra because of the breach in the webway caused by Magnus's psychic intrusion. He could not leave to fight the heresy in person. This meant that Horus had to come to him, which meant that the Molech power had to drive Horus toward Terra rather than allowing him to consolidate and fight a patient war, which meant that Molech's trap function was essential to the heresy ending the way it did, which meant that the Emperor surviving in the specific condition of the Golden Throne was a consequence of the same chain of events. He sacrificed himself, in some sense, us in the confrontation with Horus, sustaining wounds that made the Golden Throne necessary rather than merely useful. The Molech plan succeeded in ending the heresy, but part of the price of its success was the Emperor's imprisonment in the very mechanism that had kept him in place long enough for the trap to function. 10,000 years of 1,000 psychers dying per day to sustain him. 10,000 years of the Imperium gradually calcifying around his absence. The bureaucracy that was supposed to serve his vision, replacing that vision with its own survival instincts. The religion he explicitly forbade growing into the most powerful institution in human civilization. The Imperium of the 41st Millennium is a monument to what happens when the most important person in an organization is no longer available to correct its drift. And the drift has had 10 millennia to accumulate. Molech did not cause all of this, but the chain from Molech to the Emperor's current condition is direct enough that you can trace it without speculative leaps. The second major downstream consequence is the state of the traitor legions, the death of Horus, and the specific manner of that death. Soul obliterated, chaos investment destroyed, the unified champion of the four powers removed from existence, scattered the traitor forces in a way that no military victory could have accomplished. The traitor legions fled into the Eye of Terror and spent subsequent millennia fighting each other, as much as the Imperium. The unity that Horus's extraordinary charisma and authority had imposed dissolving immediately without him. Every subsequent Black Crusade, every emergence from the Eye, on every attempt to reconstitute a unified traitor force, all of it is the Chaos Gods trying to replace what they lost when Horus was destroyed at the culmination of the Molech chain. They have not yet succeeded. Abaddon comes closest, and Abaddon's specific relationship to the legacy of Horus is itself one of the defining threads of 40,000 lore. But no one has been Horus. No one has been the War Master. And the galaxy the Imperium defends is still standing, however precariously, 10,000 years after Molech, in part because the unified command that Molech made possible and then destroyed has never been fully reconstituted. The third consequence is one that is easy to overlook, but that shapes almost everything about the 41st Millennium's spiritual and psychic landscape. The Chaos Gods know that the Emperor tricked them at Molech, or believe that he did, or have told themselves and everyone who will listen that he did. Whether the characterization is accurate or not, the framing of the Molech event as a broken bargain has defined the Chaos Gods' relationship to humanity across 10,000 years. They want their debt paid. They want what was promised. They believe that the full corruption and consumption of humanity is owed to them, and they have been working toward that payment with the patience and the determination that 10,000-year grudges tend to produce. The ruinous powers are not simply opposed to the Imperium as a political or military rival. They are opposed to it as creditors pursuing a defaulted debt. The intensity of that opposition, the specific quality of the Chaos Gods' relationship to human souls, may have roots in whatever the Emperor took from them at Molech, or refused to give them, or made them believe he took and refused to give. This is speculative in the sense that the lore presents it from the perspective of entities whose reliability is, as we have discussed, severely limited. But speculation about motivation and context is not the same as speculation about fact. and the motivation the Chaos Gods seem to have for their specific relationship to humanity. Their particular investment in its corruption and consumption above all other species is consistent with the Molech framing, even if it was not caused by it. The fourth consequence is the hardest to categorize because it is not a consequence of the Molech trap specifically, but of the knowledge the Emperor extracted from the gate, the nature of the Primarchs themselves, and on what that nature means for the 10,000 years after the heresy. The Primarchs who survived the heresy and did not die or disappear in its immediate aftermath dispersed across the galaxy in various ways. Guilliman was placed in stasis after being wounded by Fulgrim. The lion went into a sleep beneath the rock that lasted until the events of Dark Imperium. Others vanished or transformed or were reported dead. The only one actively present in the current era of the setting is Guilliman himself, restored by Celestine and the Inead Shard, leading the Indomitus Crusade in his father's name. But the return of Guilliman, and everything that his return reveals about the state of the Imperium, is itself a consequence of the Primarch project, which is a consequence of what the Emperor learned at Molech. Guilliman is exactly what the Emperor intended him to be, a being of extraordinary capability who can diagnose the Imperium's dysfunction with perfect clarity, who understands what the Emperor's actual vision was because he was built to embody part of it, and who is now trying to rebuild something approaching that vision in the teeth of 10,000 years of accumulated institutional failure. Whether he will succeed, whether the Imperium can be salvaged, whether humanity can survive the escalating catastrophes of the 41st millennium, all of this ultimately traces back to whether the Emperor's original design was robust enough to work even under the conditions of the galaxy that Molech and its consequences produced. Was the Primarchs as artifacts of the dark knowledge? What made them who they were? One thing that the Molech story adds to the understanding of the Primarchs that tends to get discussed abstractly, but deserves more concrete attention, is the question of what the warp knowledge the Emperor extracted from the gate actually did to each of them as individuals. The Primarchs are often discussed as if their personalities were simply the natural products of their genetics and their homeworlds. Horus was charismatic and brilliant because of his genetics, shaped by Chthonia's brutal criminal culture. Sanguinius was beautiful and compassionate because of his genetics, shaped by the harsh and hostile world of Baal. Lorgar was spiritually oriented and intellectually hungry because of his genetics, shaped by the religious culture of Colchis. That all of this is true, but it is incomplete. The warp infusion the Emperor performed on each of their souls during the creation process was not a neutral enhancement of pre-existing qualities. It was an addition of something from the immaterium, something with its own character and its own resonance, something that expressed itself through the Primarch's existing personality, but was not simply derived from it. Think about what this means for the specific way each Primarch fell or was threatened. Khorne received blood and war, and the Primarchs most associated with this energy in their warp infusion were the most physically violent and the most drawn to conflict for its own sake. Angron, whose warp infusion seems to have carried an intense charge of martial aggression, was the easiest for Khorne to claim. The butcher's nails that had been drilled into his skull did not create the vulnerability. They exploited one that was already there, that had been placed there by an emperor who needed a general capable of fighting wars that no one else could win, and accepted the consequences of what that capability required. Fulgrim and Slaanesh are perhaps the clearest example. The Emperor's children. Primarch carried in his soul an extreme orientation toward perfection, toward excellence, toward the refinement of all things, toward their highest expression. These are not inherently dangerous qualities. Pursued with wisdom and balance, they produce extraordinary art, extraordinary craft, extraordinary leadership. But they are also exactly the frequency that the chaos god of excess vibrates at, and the resonance point where the desire for more and better has no limiting principle that would prevent it from cascading into obsession, consumption, and ultimately the complete dissolution of the self into the pursuit of sensation. The path from Fulgrim's genuine love of excellence to Fulgrim, the possessed puppet of Slaanesh is a path that the warp energy woven into his soul at creation made traversable, not inevitable, but traversable, in a way that the same qualities without the warp connection would not have been. Magnus and Tzeentch. The Crimson King carried in his soul an extraordinary hunger for knowledge and understanding, a drive to comprehend the mechanisms of reality that went beyond intellectual curiosity into something closer to compulsion. Tzeentch, the architect of fate, the god whose domain is the manipulation of information and the endless proliferation of schemes and counter-schemes, is perfectly positioned to approach a being with that warp signature. The tragedy of Magnus is partly the tragedy of a warp-infused quality that was, in his case, almost completely indistinguishable from his genuine self. His curiosity was not a mask for something else. It was what he actually was. And what he actually was had been given a specific warp resonance at creation that made him specifically visible to the one entity in the Imperium most interested in the corruption of knowledge-seeking minds. This pattern repeats across each of the Primarchs who fell, and it suggests something about the relationship between the Emperor's choices at Molech and the heresy itself that goes beyond the trap theory. The trap theory explains why the Emperor brought Horus and the others to Molech during the Great Crusade. It explains the calibrated defenses and the imperfect memory wipe. It explains the strategic architecture of how the heresy ended. But it does not fully explain the heresy itself. The fact that so many Primarchs fell, the fact that the corruption of the suns was so widespread and so deep. The Primarchs fell, in part, because they had been built with specific warp vulnerabilities, because the knowledge the Emperor extracted from the Molech Gate was the knowledge of how to weave the warp into a living soul. And weaving the warp into a living soul means giving that soul both extraordinary capabilities and extraordinary exposure. The Emperor accepted that exposure as the price of the capability. He may have trusted, perhaps too much, and in his own ability to protect his sons from the consequences of what he had built into them. He may have miscalculated the degree to which his physical absence from their formation, the absence caused by the scattering of the Primarchs, which was itself caused by the warp access created by the Molech knowledge, would leave them without the specific guidance they needed to manage their own warp vulnerabilities across a lifetime. He may have known exactly what would happen and accepted it as part of the same long calculation that produced the trap at Molech. Any of these, or some combination of all three. This is the Emperor at his most opaque, and the Molech story at its most morally uncomfortable. The possibility that the man who built the galaxy's greatest heroes also built the mechanisms of their destruction. That the gifts and the wounds came from the same source, that the same knowledge that made the Primarchs capable of reshaping a galaxy also made them accessible to the things that would eventually reach through that access and unmake them. The quiet heroism at the center. Olivia Sorica and what she represents. I want to come back, at the end, to Olivia Sorica. Not because her story has been under-discussed tonight. We have talked about her at several points and acknowledged the significance of her vigil and her sacrifice, but because I think she is, in an important sense, the emotional core of the Molech story, in a way that can get obscured by all the strategic analysis and philosophical questioning. The Molech story is, from one angle, a story about a being of incomprehensible power and incomprehensible strategic vision, arranging the fates of millions of people in service of a plan that none of them understood. That angle is real and important, and we should not flinch from the moral weight it carries. But the Molech story is also, from another angle, a story about a woman who made a choice to be loyal to something she believed in, and who maintained that loyalty across an almost incomprehensible span of time, and who stood up at the moment of maximum pressure and did the most she could with what she had. Olivia Sorica did not know the full shape of what she was protecting. She knew the gate was important. She knew the Emperor wanted it guarded. She presumably understood at some level that the knowledge of what lay beneath the western hills of Molechari was the kind of knowledge that could reshape history if it fell into the wrong hands. But she did not know, could not have known, the precise mechanism by which the trap would function. the specific way in which the Emperor had structured the breadcrumb trail for a potential traitor son, the exact manner in which her failure to close the gate would shape what Horus experienced on the other side. She was given a mission that she could believe in. Protect something important, prevent harm, without being given the complete picture of why the specific mission had been structured the way it was. And she did it anyway. For 10,000 years she did it, building a life on a world that was not originally hers, forming attachments that she knew would be temporary by the standards of her own lifespan, maintaining a vigil that the people around her did not know she was maintaining. She became a person in the process rather than simply a function. She accumulated love and grief and specific knowledge of what it meant to be alive on that particular world at that particular time. Knowledge that belongs to her, and not to anyone who assigned her the mission. She was a person who also happened to be a guardian, rather than a guardian who happened to have a person inside her. At the moment of crisis, she moved with the decisiveness and the capability that 10,000 years of preparation and her own nature as a perpetual gave her. She recruited allies with the practical efficiency of someone who understood that ideal conditions were not available and the available conditions would have to do. She moved toward the gate rather than away from it, toward the most dangerous place on a planet that was in the process of being destroyed, because the person she had chosen to be was not the kind of person who moved away from the thing that needed to be done simply because doing it was lethal. She almost closed the gate. Almost. The margin of her failure is measured in seconds, in the precise timing of Horus's arrival relative to the completion of the ritual. If she had started slightly sooner, or if the Ultramarines had held the passages slightly longer, or if any of the 1,000 small contingencies of a desperate last stand had resolved slightly differently, what the gate would have been sealed and the Molech plan would have been null and void. Horus would not have gone through. The power he obtained there would not have been obtained. The heresy would have continued on different terms toward a different ending, with consequences that neither the Emperor nor anyone else could have fully predicted. She failed, not through lack of capability, not through lack of courage, not through any failure of will or preparation. She failed because Horus Lupercal was the most dangerous being in the galaxy at that moment, and he arrived at the gate at the moment when the only thing standing between him and it was one person doing a ritual with both hands full. The damage she did to the gate matters. The fact that the portal Horus stepped through was compromised by her partial closure matters. Whatever difference that made to what he experienced on the other side, whatever slight limitation it placed on how fully the Chaos Gods could invest in him, whatever structural weakness it introduced into the power he returned with. That is her contribution to the outcome, not the dramatic contribution of having closed the gate completely, the quiet, invisible contribution of having made it not quite whole, of having done just enough that the thing she failed to fully accomplish still left a mark on the mechanism she was trying to stop. This is what the Horus heresy is full of, if you read it carefully. People who failed to do the thing they were trying to do, but whose failure was partial rather than complete, and whose partial failures shape the final outcome in ways that are invisible to everyone except the reader who is paying close attention. The Molech story is built on this principle. The Emperor's plan is not triumphant in a clean way. It is barely successful. It is successful by margins that make you understand how close the other outcome was. And some of those margins belong to Olivia Soreka, and to the Ultramarines who died in the caves, and to the Blood Angels who chose death over corruption, and to the loyal soldiers of House Divine's minor branches who fought to the last on a world where their own highest house had betrayed them. History, the real kind, is full of people like this. People who did what they could, and whose doing what they could was necessary to the outcome, even when it did not look like a victory. Olivia Soreka is the Molech story's most human figure, the one who most clearly expresses what it looks like to be caught inside a plan that is larger than you, and to do the right thing within it anyway. Not because you understand the full plan, but because you know your own values, and you act on them. She survived Molech. She found her daughters on the ship. She carried on. The final thought. What Molech is really about. I have been talking for a long time about Molech, and I want to bring everything to a close with a thought that I think is the most important thing I have said tonight, or at least the one I most want you to carry away. Molech is not, at its deepest level, a story about a secret, or a battle, or a trap, or a bargain. Mas, all of those things are real, and they matter, and we have spent a great deal of time with them tonight, for good reason. But the heart of the Molech story, the thing that makes it significant beyond its plot function in the Horus Heresy narrative, is the question it poses about what it means to protect something. The Emperor of mankind has devoted his entire existence to protecting humanity. That devotion is not in question. The care is real, the love is real. The extraordinary lengths to which he has gone across tens of thousands of years are all in the record, available for inspection. He is, by any measure, the being who has done the most for the human species of any individual in its history. The Imperium is flawed and brutal and cruel, but it is also the thing between humanity and the abyss. And the abyss is real, and the threat is genuine. But the Molech story asks, what kind of protection is this? What does it mean to protect something by treating the individual lives inside it as acceptable losses in a calculation that serves the collective? What does it mean to love humanity so much that you will use specific humans as instruments without telling them what you are using them for? What does it mean to be the guardian of a species when the guardianship requires you to orchestrate the deaths of millions so that the species as a whole can survive? These are not rhetorical questions. They are genuine ones. There are contexts in which we recognize that some losses are necessary to prevent worse losses, that some tragedies are unavoidable and the only choice available is how to channel them. Yet the Emperor may be operating in exactly that context, genuinely facing a universe in which the alternatives to what he did at Molech were worse for humanity in the aggregate than what he chose. The Chaos Gods are not a metaphor. They are real, and they are powerful, and they genuinely want to consume humanity's collective soul. The threat is existential. The response might have needed to be exactly as cold and exactly as long-sighted as it was. But recognizing the context does not dissolve the moral weight of the specific people who bore the cost of his choices. The 58 million soldiers of Molech, Olivia Soreka's 10,000 years, every person who died in the heresy as a consequence of the dynamics set in motion at the gate. They mattered as individuals, not merely as statistical components of the species the Emperor was protecting. Well, the Molech story holds both of those things. The genuine necessity of the protection and the genuine cost to specific individuals, in the same frame, without resolving the tension, because the tension is the truth. This is why Warhammer 40,000 resonates the way it does with so many people across so many years. Not because it is escapist fantasy in which the good guys win cleanly, but because it is a universe that takes seriously the question of what it costs to survive, what kinds of choices have to be made, and what kinds of people make them, and what is lost in the making, and refuses to wrap those costs in a comfortable absolution. The Emperor won at Molech, in the sense that the heresy ended on his terms, and the Molech plan left behind a world of dead soldiers and a ruined gate, and a woman who had given 10,000 years to guarding a door that she was, in the end, designed to almost but not quite close in time. That is the story of Molech. The winning that costs everything, the protection that uses the protected, the love that is indistinguishable from control. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, 10,000 years of a woman choosing every single day to stay at her post. There is so much more to explore here. The Siege of Terror series, written by Dan Abnett, Guy Haley, John French, Aaron Dembski-Bowden, and others, shows the culmination of the Molech chain in extraordinary detail. Vengeful Spirit by Graham McNeil is where the Molech story is told most directly, and it rewards multiple reads. If you want to understand Olivia Soreka fully, her story threads through several shorter works as well, and it is worth following. If tonight's video was worth your time, if the story of Molech has changed how you think about the Emperor, the Primarchs, or the heresy, The most meaningful thing you can do for this channel is leave a like and subscribe to Q on 40K. Every single one matters. This channel exists to bring you exactly this kind of deep, unhurried, story-first engagement with the lore of Warhammer 40,000, and the best way to make sure there is more of it is to let the algorithm know that this is something people want. There is so much more to cover, so many rooms still locked, so many questions the lore is still only beginning to answer. Until next time, take care of yourselves, keep the faith. Yes, and remember that in the grim darkness of the far future, even the most necessary sacrifices deserve to be witnessed and named and mourned. A note on the sources. What is confirmed? What is interpretation? Before I leave you tonight, I want to be transparent about something that matters in any serious lore discussion, and that is the distinction between what the texts confirm directly and what represents the most defensible reading of the evidence. What is directly confirmed in the lore? The Emperor visited Molech during the Dark Age of technology in a one-way spacecraft with perpetual companions including Olivia Sureka. He entered a warp gate beneath the planet's surface. He emerged, changed, with new knowledge and abilities. He left Olivia Sureka as a guardian, and he returned during the Great Crusade in 869 of the 30th Millennium with 4 Primarchs, the Lion, Horus, Fulgrim, and Jagatai Khan. He spent 111 days there, massively fortified the planet, and then erased the memories of the compliance from all who accompanied him. During the heresy, Horus learned of Molech through the preserved memories of Dwell colonists, invaded with the sons of Horus and the Death Guard, broke through the defenses in one of the most devastating battles of the entire war, killed Olivia Sureka at the gate, stepped through into the warp, emerged claiming he had gotten exactly what he wanted, and then drove for Terra. The gate itself was damaged by Olivia's partial ritual before Horus shattered it with Worldbreaker. After Molech, Horus was visibly changed, and the burning process that would consume him had begun. What the demons claim, and what should be taken with significant skepticism, that the Emperor made a bargain with the Chaos Gods and broke it, that the power he obtained was their gift, rather than something he took, observed, or was exposed to through proximity, that this broken bargain is the reason they claim on humanity's soul. These claims may contain truth, or they may be entirely constructed to serve the emotional and strategic purposes of the entities making them. What is the interpretation of lore analysts rather than direct text? The trap theory. The argument that the Emperor deliberately chose those specific Primarchs, deliberately calibrated the defenses, deliberately preserved the breadcrumb trail. It deliberately designed the whole mechanism to channel a traitor son toward a specific and self-defeating acquisition of power. This interpretation is supported by strong circumstantial evidence, but is not explicitly confirmed in any text I am aware of. It is the most coherent explanation of the Emperor's behavior if you apply the principle that his choices are not random, but it remains interpretation rather than confirmed lore. I wanted you to know which category each part of tonight's discussion fell into, because the Molech story is one where the distinction between confirmed lore and compelling interpretation is especially important. The confirmed parts are extraordinary enough on their own. The interpretive framework makes them even more extraordinary. And the deliberate gaps left in the telling are themselves part of what makes Molech one of the most significant pieces of world building in the entire Horus Heresy series, a mystery that deepens the more carefully you look at it, that asks more questions the more answers you find, that refuses to resolve into something smaller than the weight it actually carries in the story of the galaxy that the Master of Mankind built and paid for. That is Molech. That is what the Emperor saw there, and that is why, 10,000 years later, the galaxy still bears the shape of decisions made in the dark, beneath the western hills of a jungle world that most people have never heard of.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.